Alone had somewhat expected problems like these to arise. In the game, the Palacio family merely appeared as a stepping stone for the protagonist's growth, but in the Kingdom of Asteria, the weight that the name carried was quite significant. Of course, this status didn't necessarily mean that they were held in high honor. Even if, for about 3 generations, they were considered a highly reputable family within the kingdom, the current Count Palacio family was renowned as the most notorious troublemaker among the nobility in the eastern region. To elaborate a bit more, they were known as a noble family that became incredibly bothersome if provoked. However, if there was something Alone overlooked despite being aware of this issue. This wine has a rather unique taste. Ooh? What? I quite like wine, and this one has a very distinct aroma. I'd love to take a few bottles home. I'll speak to my father and have some brought to you. Pardon? It was that the Palacio family's propensity for trouble far exceeded his imagination. Alone watched the young lady, who shrunk back like a frightened mouse and quickly bowed her head, before scurrying away. He wore a hollow expression. Privacy settings. Look at that. He's threatening Lady Malentino to forcefully take their specialty wine. Is that so? Just listen to him. It's exactly like when the eldest son of Palacio made threats before. And that wine is a limited edition specialty. As Alone pondered what the problem might be, he heard a small voice and thought to himself with a bitter expression. Leo, that damned troublemaker? Feeling despondent, Alone glanced at the place where the young ladies had been gossiping until just a moment ago. Upon noticing his gaze, they quickly lowered their heads and disappeared somewhere. Alone couldn't comprehend the situation at all. Wasn't it just one of those notorious families in the East? Of course, he could guess that there were negative rumors about the family, and he understood why some nobles might avoid them. But he didn't expect it to be this extreme. More accurately, he hadn't known that the Palacio family was so notoriously ill-reputed among the nobility. He hadn't anticipated being treated this way just because of a misunderstanding about him bringing down the family's troublemakers. So, does this mean socializing is out of the question? Just as Alone let out a small sigh. Hello. He turned at the voice, only to see a girl in a black dress smiling alluringly at him. Even among the young ladies present at this ball, she stood out for her stunning beauty. Alone greeted her with a return smile. Hello, Lady Zenonia. Oh my, do you know me? Of course. From Alone's perspective, it was impossible not to know her. This was only natural, as the girl standing before him was the eldest daughter of the Zenonia family, who, like the Palacio family, were known for their notoriety in the western region. In 6 years, she wouldn't just be the eldest daughter of the Zenonia family, she would become Countess Zenonia herself. Furthermore, she was one of the 3 major villains the protagonist would confront in the future in the Kingdom of Asteria. You're quite famous, after all. Famous, you say? Indeed. In short, she was someone he'd rather not get involved with. Seeing the momentary, subtle emotion flicker in Lady Zenonia's eyes, Alone continued. Privacy settings. Because you are so beautiful. Noble society was inherently quite complex. Even within Asteria, there were more than a handful of factions. These factions were split into royalists and nobility, both fervently engaged in political struggles. And it wasn't just empty political rhetoric. Since real interests were at stake, politics were a crucial element for the nobles. Of course, Alone hadn't come to the ball to socialize for the sake of politics. Even though it was half-baked, Alone's goal was still to live a peaceful life, and he knew very well that the words peace and politics could never coexist. Nevertheless, the reason he had intended to socialize to some extent was that even minimal connections could be helpful in aristocratic life. Except for this person. Alone looked at Lady Zenonia. The Zenonia family, like the Palacio family, was regarded as a notorious troublemaker in the western region. Unlike the Palacio family, which stayed out of politics to act without consequences, the Zenonia family leveraged political situations to their advantage. In other words, they were a bit more cunning than the Palacio family. Perhaps more like a corporate criminal organization. Thank you for the compliment. It's the truth. As a result, one might think that socializing with Lady Zenonia wouldn't be a bad idea if Alone wasn't planning to engage in politics. However, that would be a mistake. People tend to congregate with others like themselves. Politicians attract other politicians, and thugs gather around other thugs. So, if Alone were to forge a connection with Lady Zenonia in such a situation? If you were willing to dabble in illegal activities like those dead Palacio troublemakers, it might be a valuable connection. But if not, it would be an irreversible mistake. In the worst-case scenario, he might even end up becoming one of Lady Zenonia's pawns. Contrary to external rumors of him belonging to a group with a sword master, Alone was, in reality, just an ordinary noble with nothing to his name. I'd like to talk more. What do you think? I'd love to, but unfortunately, I think I must leave for today. Is that so? Lady Zenonia's eyes narrowed briefly, exuding a predatory vibe. A look impossible to decipher. However, just for a moment. Privacy settings. The young lady's eyes opened slightly as if she were surprised by something, then she nodded as if she understood, a smile appearing on her face. Just as the rumor said. Pardon? It's nothing. I look forward to seeing you again. With those words, she brushed past him. Alone turned around and looked at Lady Zenonia with a puzzled expression. A specialty wine from Malentino. Tangerine tea from Pina. Crafted metalwork from Villander. A premium horse from Paldion. These were the spoils Alone had gathered, instead of making friends, after he resolved to make a few acquaintances since he was already there. Socializing is a lost cause. Looking at the list of spoils he had obtained instead of acquaintances, Alone let out a helpless chuckle. I knew it, I shouldn't have studied something like noble hobbies. Recalling the wine studies he had undertaken, hoping it might help with socializing, Alone smacked his lips. He then turned around to do what he had originally intended. Just a moment. HM. Another voice called out to Alone. Hello. Turning his head, Alone saw a woman in a splendid red dress, adorned with various accessories. It seemed she had paid a lot of attention to her appearance, down to the most minute details. However, despite her meticulous appearance, her face held no particular expression. Yes, hello. Facing her, Alone greeted her while noticing how out of place she seemed in her outfit. She promptly asked him a question. If you have a moment, could we talk? Alone looked at her with a slightly surprised expression. There had only been one person who had initiated a conversation with him at this ball. Is she from the same side as Zenonia? Privacy settings. For a brief moment, he recalled a list of villains from the Kingdom of Asteria and then nodded. Sure. Whatever her intentions might be, she wasn't on the list of villains Alone had in his mind, and, more importantly, she had approached him for a conversation. The two of them stepped out onto the terrace to have a light chat. Soon after. May I ask your name, young lady? Forgive my late introduction. I am Roria, the third daughter of the Duke of Alsha. Ah. The Alsha family. Yes. Alone involuntarily let out a sigh inwardly. The Alsha family was a notorious one from the northern part of Asteria. And like Lady Zenonia, it was a family associated with one of the three major villains, the Duke of Alsha. Then again, it's unlikely that anyone who approaches me would be normal. I should have asked for her name first. Alone thought, realizing how quickly he had grasped his situation from just attending a single ball. But why don't I remember her? Alone looked at Roria's face. Her elaborate adornment only enhanced her already outstanding beauty. With a face like this, there's no way I wouldn't know her. In Psychedelia, every member of the Alsha family was a villain. In other words, if she were a member of the Alsha family, Alone, who had played the game multiple times, should at least remember her name, even if he hadn't memorized her face. That's why, after pondering, Alone asked directly. May I be blunt? What is it? Please lend me your strength. Strength. I am about to be assassinated. At those words, Alone realized one truth. In the game, the total number of Alsha family members he'd seen was 4, the Duke of Alsha, his 2 elder sisters, and 1 younger brother. So, for Roria to be the third daughter. In other words, it meant that Roria was already dead 6 years into the future. My sisters? No, they? They will try to kill me soon. Privacy settings. Summarizing Roria's story, which started as soon as he realized the truth, it was as follows. She was the daughter of the Duke's only concubine, whom he loved more than his legitimate wife. She had survived up until now because of his favor. However, the Duke of Alsha was now gravely ill and could pass away any day. In other words, the moment the Duke died, so would Roria. Then, why are you asking me for help? With your power, it should be possible. For the first time, her face showed signs of anxiety. I refuse. But even seeing that expression, Alone had no choice but to reject her request. Of course, I'm not asking you to do this for free. If you help me, I will offer you half of the Alsha families. I'm afraid I must decline. Roria's expression was urgent as she spoke. However, Alone's response remained unchanged. It wasn't that he didn't feel sympathy for Roria. Had he possessed the strength, her request would have been worth considering, even if he didn't agree outright. Unfortunately, Alone didn't have that kind of power. Most of the rumors surrounding Alone were untrue. He didn't have an assassin who killed Leo of the Palacio family, nor did he have the strength of a swordmaster that had taken down Avalon. Therefore, I'll be going now. As Alone turned around, he saw the despair flickering in Roria's silent eyes. However, Alone didn't gain any power from seeing that. He was too busy just trying to take care of himself. Thus, as he was about to walk back toward the ballroom, he clicked his tongue and looked back at Roria. Good things will happen. A blessing spoken to lighten his own somber mood. Roria gave no response. Alone didn't expect one either, as he turned away. I hope we can meet again. It was merely the faint echo of his modern sensibilities that made his heart ache slightly, so he murmured while looking absent-mindedly at the crescent moon-shaped chandelier to offer some comfort. And then, privacy settings. It would be best to report this part to the Red Moon. On the roof of the ballroom, where the chandelier hung, an observer, stationed to monitor Alone and cut off any information about the Avalon incident if necessary, turned to his side and spoke. There's no need. She's not one of the targets. Even if we do nothing, Layden will handle it. I see. So, she's the only one among Alsha's children who isn't a target for Layden. Yes. In any case, we should focus on other matters. As the observer with green eyes shifted his gaze to another location, Deus also turned his eyes in another direction. There, he saw a black-clad figure quietly tailing Alone. Is it a tail? Deus silently began to gather his mana to deal with the figure, but then he hesitated. He recalled Yusha's order not to act rashly without permission. Thus, let's just watch for now. Deus and Rhine decided to quietly observe the black-clad figure following Alone. Alone's ostensible reason for coming to the Estravan territory was to build connections. However, the real reason he endured a journey of over a week to get here was because of a labyrinth located to the south of Estravan. Is this the place where you said you had some business? Yes. It took us 2 weeks to find this place, but there's nothing here. As Evan slowly scanned the empty forest, he spoke. Alone also looked around. Indeed, the only things around were an unpaved road and forest that seemed to have been neglected for a long time. There were no features that stood out. That's why I had to go through so much trouble for 2 weeks. Alone's face remained expressionless, but he let out a sigh of relief inwardly. After the ball, Alone had spent nearly 20 days in Estravan, investing his time in finding this labyrinth. I took it too lightly just because it was easy to find in the game. Thinking that, Alone shifted his gaze to a small ravine visible beyond the forest. He began to walk toward the only clue that had allowed him to find the labyrinth. Are you sure this time? Having already wasted 2 trips, Evan grumbled as he followed Alone. Sensing Evan's footsteps behind him, Alone quickly organized his thoughts. The name of the labyrinth is the Whispering Labyrinth. It's a labyrinth accessible around the middle of the game, and the reward for clearing it is the item called Constraint. Once I get that, my business in the labyrinth will be done. Privacy settings. Recalling the characteristics of the labyrinth he had visited hundreds of times in Psychedelia, Alone walked without hesitation. Soon, he arrived at a small ravine beyond the forest. This place looks strange no matter how you look at it. Evan spoke as soon as they reached the ravine. Just as he murmured, the ravine was small, but it had an unmistakable sense of wrongness. Despite the sun hanging high in the sky, the interior of the ravine was excessively dark, as if it were repelling the sunlight. This triggered a sense of alarm and caution in Evan. Let's go. Young master. But instead, this phenomenon filled Alone with joy. The effect in the ravine was identical to the field effect of the Whispering Labyrinth he was searching for. This meant that the Whispering Labyrinth was indeed here, so he stepped into the dark ravine without hesitation. Evan watched Alone with a shocked expression but had no choice but to follow him inside. Entering the ravine felt like the presence of the sun a moment ago was a lie. The interior was shrouded in darkness. In the darkness, various stones, carved with what seemed to be artificial patterns rather than natural formations, could be seen scattered around. Walking past these, Alone soon spotted an entrance submerged in pitch-black darkness. Alone stood staring blankly at the door, which was undoubtedly artificially constructed, covered with various patterns. "How did you know this place existed?" "Because I've been here often." "What?" Realizing he had made a slip of the tongue, Alone quickly corrected himself. "It was a joke." "A joke?" With that face, it didn't sound like a joke at all. "So how did you know about it?" "I have my ways." For someone with ways, it did take you quite some time to find this place. "I didn't expect it to take this long either." As Alone briefly recalled playing Psychedelia, Evan asked another question. "So, who made this unpleasant place?" "It was made by a fellow named Paleon." "The Whispering Labyrinth." Privacy settings. Alone recalled that in some online communities, it was also referred to as Paleon's Water Rocket Labyrinth. "Paleon, you say? Let's go in." Without answering any more of Evan's questions, Alone walked toward the labyrinth entrance, and Evan, looking nervous and cautious, followed him. Soon, no one was left at the entrance of the labyrinth. Screech tilde. Crack. Crackle. Crunch. A hell gargoyle, which would only be defeatable around the mid-story progression of Psychedelia, was being slowly crushed to death as if caught in a massive stone press that had fallen from the ceiling. Evan looked on with a pale face. Oh. Watching such a powerful monster, which he could never defeat alone, die in such a futile and gruesome way was enough to leave a mark on his normally stoic disposition, honed by years as a mercenary. However, what made Evan's heart pound even more was the realization that the massive stone currently crushing the hell gargoyle hung above their heads as well. How can the young master be so calm in this situation? Evan looked at Alone. Despite the fact that failing to solve even one puzzle in this labyrinth would lead to a brutal death like the gargoyles, Alone's face remained expressionless. He seemed to be waiting for the door to open, completely unfazed by the situation. Seeing Alone like this only intensified Evan's curiosity about him. Usually, no matter how inscrutable a magician might be, for years together would reveal at least a little of their true nature. Moreover, Evan had helped Alone with many things over the past 4 years. Sometimes he saved orphans. Sometimes he took down evil organizations. Other times, he helped a slave girl or paid off an old man's debt. If not, he'd deliver messages with no apparent meaning to acquaintances. He dealt with all sorts of tasks. Yet, despite handling all these tasks, Evan still didn't know Alone. This was because none of the tasks Alone had assigned provided any clues about his true intentions. The closest thing to a common thread was that Alone seemed to take a sustained interest in some of the children he had saved, sending them to orphanages. Apart from that, there was much Evan didn't know about Alone. Privacy settings. For example, how Alone knew about such a place despite never having left the Palacio estate. Or how he understood the workings of this eerie labyrinth and could confidently answer its questions. Nevertheless, despite the suspicions he harbored, Evan had developed a peculiar trust in Alone, which was enough for him to follow Alone into this suspicious place, partly due to the fact that all the tasks Alone had undertaken ultimately led to good outcomes. What exactly is he preparing? But even with this trust, his curiosity wasn't fading. Evan looked at Alone with eyes mixed with admiration and intrigue as Alone inspected his surroundings with an indifferent expression. "I think I'm going to be sick." In truth, Alone was forcibly averting his gaze to avoid watching the gargoyle being crushed horribly. "I knew it was gruesome, but not this much." Screech tilde. Alone confirmed the door opening as soon as the gargoyle's execution concluded and let out a sigh. Even though he wasn't capable of proper combat, the reason he confidently entered the Whispering Labyrinth, accessible only around the mid-game, was because he knew about this labyrinth. "Thanks to that, I cleared it easily." This labyrinth consisted of 8 rooms, each requiring him to solve a puzzle before progressing to the next. Knowing all the puzzles in this labyrinth meant he wouldn't need to fight any enemies, and Alone remembered every puzzle precisely. No, from the perspective of a Psychedelia player, the puzzles in this labyrinth were unforgettable. This was one of the few labyrinths where one could re-enter repeatedly without collecting the rewards, making it ideal for grinding levels. Naturally, Alone, who had always used this place for mid-game grinding over countless playthroughs, had memorized all the puzzles and reached the end of the labyrinth with ease. Dragging along Evan, who was utterly exhausted despite no combat having taken place, Alone entered a small room at the end of the labyrinth, where he picked up a ring lying on an old table in the center. It was a plain-looking ring, so unremarkable that some might openly express disappointment, sensing no power from it. However, Alone smiled. He was sure the item he held was the constraint he had been looking for. He also didn't mind the ring's lack of a flashy appearance. "Ooh? Young master, that ring you were holding just." In the first place, this item didn't function as an artifact, it was more like an elixir that would be absorbed into the user's body the moment it was used. Privacy settings. Now that we've got what we need, let's go. As the ring disappeared from Alone's hand, Evan, who had been surprised, saw Alone turning around as if he had finished everything he needed to do. Evan, still looking dumbfounded, quickly followed Alone out of the room. And, as soon as they reached the exit, the labyrinth shut down entirely, as if everything had concluded. Alone and Evan, who had escaped safely, found themselves facing something unexpected. Did you foresee this as well? As soon as they exited the labyrinth, they were confronted by human-shaped golems holding weapons, standing in formation. They hadn't been there just moments ago. These golems are the stone piles we saw earlier. Realizing that these golems were the countless stone piles they had passed earlier, Evan, tense, drew his sword. "I'll handle this." "Who?" Evan responded with a puzzled expression to Alone's words. Before he could even ask a question. The constraint is now in effect. The pronouncement came from Alone's lips. Seated in the carriage heading back to the Alsha Duke's estate, Roria let out a deep sigh, her face filled with profound despair as she looked at the estate in the distance. She gave a self-deprecating smile. "As I expected, I was a fool." Roria thought of the man she had met at the ball. Alone, the third son of the Palacio family. But that was only his public identity. According to the rumors circulating among the nobility, he had killed his two older brothers, who were major figures in the underworld, and had even wiped out Avalon, which had been almost ruling the eastern region overnight. He was the true mastermind of the Palacio family, hiding his power and waiting for the right time to reveal his claws. No, it's not just rumors. Having met Alone, Roria knew without a doubt that those rumors were true. The emotional restraint he had displayed at the ball could never have come from someone ordinary. It was almost like looking at father. Roria thought of her father. The Duke of Alsha, known as the noble one among the aristocracy because he could manipulate both the royalists and the nobility factions within the kingdom at his will, and someone who should never be crossed. Privacy settings. Her father, who never revealed his emotions carelessly and always remained cool-headed in his judgments. The eyes of her father resembled those of Alone, whom she had seen 5 days ago. That's why Roria had clung to Alone, realizing he was her last lifeline, and she had failed. Honestly, she hadn't been surprised by the outcome. The moment she saw Alone's eyes, Roria had realized that he was not someone who would be swayed by petty sympathy or pity. Yet, she still pleaded for sympathy and pity. Because she had nothing else to offer. What she did have was just a semblance of power maintained by the Duke's mercy and affection. No matter how hard she tried to grasp something more, her efforts were always thwarted by those who could hardly be called her kin, her contemptible relatives. In other words, she was powerless, and thus, unable to seize her last lifeline. Or rather, she was the only one who thought it was a lifeline. There wouldn't be anyone willing to engage in a transaction where the risks were more apparent than the benefits. In truth, it would be a lie to say she didn't know. Even if it was just a semblance of power, she had already been through numerous situations, fighting against her despicable relatives who had everything, trying to secure a position. So, even though she hadn't yet reached adulthood, her mind was already well versed in the world's logic. She understood all too well that every relationship and story carried both gains and losses. Good things will happen. As Roria gazed out of the window at the scenery of the estate, she recalled those seemingly meaningless words Alone had said at the end. About 30 minutes later, when she returned to the mansion. "What did you say?" "Lady Phelan and Lord Kig have passed away." She heard from a maid that 2 of her siblings, who had tormented her so much, had taken their own lives. Hearing this news, Roria, looking perplexed, went to her room, feeling baffled by their deaths. Her detestable family members were more likely to stab each other in the back than commit suicide. In other words, the fact that those 2 had committed suicide made no sense from the beginning. Privacy settings. This is absurd. Certain that some scheme was at play, Roria suddenly remembered the words of that man, the third son of the Palacio family. No. Good things will happen. Recalling the words of the true mastermind who had killed all his siblings and ascended to become the heir of the Count's family. She felt a chill run down her spine. Collier, the eldest daughter of the Zenonia territory, had just arrived at the estate and reached the study where the Count was. She found herself once again thinking about a man she had recalled numerous times. Alone Palacio, who had recently killed all his brothers in the Count's family and secured the position of heir. Famous, indeed. Collier recalled the look in the man's eyes as he had gazed at her. Eyes that revealed nothing, as if peering into an abyss beyond the northern lands, indifferent to everything. No matter how many times she thought about it, those eyes sent chills down her arms. Through those eyes, Collier realized something, that he was the same kind as herself. In truth, if that were all, Collier would have stopped thinking about him once he had rejected her proposal. Rejecting her proposal essentially meant that they could not be allies, which in turn implied that they were now adversaries. Despite this, Collier's curiosity persisted, all because of something he had said. Famous, he said. The Zenonia family is certainly famous. Even if they didn't involve themselves in politics, the financial and physical power the Zenonia family wielded was strong enough to overturn the current state of the kingdom at least once. However, that renown ultimately belonged to the Count of Zenonia himself, not to the Zenonia family as a whole, and certainly not to Collier. Yet Alone had spoken of it. Privacy settings. He had referred to her so clearly and distinctly. In a situation where far more nobles had never seen her face, having only attended balls twice, he had called her famous. Not the Count of Zenonia, but her. Of course, Alone had said this without much thought, recalling her fame as a villain when the original storyline began. But to her, those words held great importance. How intriguing. Collier turned her gaze toward the Count, seated in the study. The Count was simply processing paperwork in silence. His head was bowed as if she wasn't even there, focused solely on his work. Click, click. As Collier walked over to the Count, his eyes naturally rose to meet hers. The same red eyes as hers stared back at her. Though he said nothing, the Count's appearance was brimming with vitality. Snap! At least until Collier snapped her fingers once. As soon as the snapping sound echoed, the light vanished from the Count's eyes. The eyes that had been so sharp a moment ago turned vacant like those of an idiot, and his tightly closed mouth drooped open, drool trickling out. The Count was in a state that clearly wasn't normal. Collier mumbled as she stared at him. How did he know? No one was supposed to know. Collier's expression was filled with curiosity as she thought of Alone, who had spoken as if he knew the secret she had kept hidden since she turned her father into an imbecile. Or maybe he was just taking a shot in the dark. With such doubts in mind, Collier left the study where she had been performing her ongoing act for the past 5 years. Kay Collier, my lady. What's wrong? There's a corpse in your room. At the sudden outburst, Collier quickly made her way to her room. And there. Huh? She saw it. The informant she had placed on Alone 2 weeks ago lay dead, his head twisted around twice, his eyes open wide, unable to find peace even in death. Privacy settings. It seems the seal didn't activate, so it doesn't appear he revealed any secrets. This was the report from one of the knights. The informant didn't leak any secrets, yet they brought his body into my room. Reflecting on this, Collier let out a sigh. She felt her suspicions turn into a certainty. Looks like he found a big weakness of mine right after we met. She murmured with a smile. Evan grimaced as he looked at the golems glowing bright red in the darkness of the night. Having worked as a mercenary for over 15 years since childhood, his eyes moved busily, trying to locate the golems' weak points, yet he couldn't hide his anxiety. He was confident in his skills, but precisely because of that, he was even more cautious of the unknown entities before him. He had experienced firsthand just how much danger something unknown could pose. Moreover, he had someone to protect at the moment. Facing unknown enemies whose characteristics he didn't even know was the worst-case scenario. To make matters worse, the number of enemies appeared to be easily over 20. As Evan pondered how to handle the situation. I'll handle this. Who? He responded absent-mindedly to the sudden voice, watching as Alone, without him realizing it, stepped forward. His expression was as indifferent as it had been when they entered the labyrinth. Evan found Alone incredibly mysterious and intriguing all over again. He was genuinely puzzled at how his master could maintain such an expression even in this situation. At least from Evan's perspective, the current situation was quite a crisis. In front of them were over 20 human-shaped golems that clearly needed to be dealt with, and it was certain that each one of them possessed considerable combat power. Yet, even in such a situation, Alone had stepped forward, saying he would handle them. To speak honestly about his thoughts, Evan didn't believe that Alone could deal with the golems before them. Of course, Evan knew that Alone was no ordinary person and that he had a talent for magic. He had become a respectable magician, reaching the second rank through self-study without a mentor. Privacy settings. However, impressive as that might be by general standards, it didn't mean that such accomplishments would be enough for this kind of situation. While it was true that he had reached the second rank through his own efforts at a young age, even a mere golem in front of him would be difficult to handle with just that level of power. Thud! As soon as these thoughts crossed his mind, the golems, which had been standing still, as if assessing their targets, suddenly moved and started rushing toward Alone. And then, I enact the constraint. Alone's voice resounded like a declaration. As Alone murmured the incantation, the world seemed to come to a halt. His vision turned black and white, and the movements of the golems charging at him felt as though they were being recorded by a high-speed camera. And then, a fragment inheriting the great will of Nyakula, state the 2 constraints you wish to impose. A grand voice that seemed to shake the entire space echoed in his mind. It sounded both like a man and a woman, a child and an old person. As he heard it, a brief cold sweat ran down Alone's face. As expected, it's different from the game. The artifact called Constraint that Alone obtained from the Whispering Labyrinth was just as its name suggested, it imposed limitations on the user in exchange for an equivalent reward. Once activated, numerous options would appear before him. A notification window would prompt him to choose what constraints to impose and what rewards to receive. However, reminding him that this was indeed reality, what appeared before him was not a notification window, but a voice. A voice that, just by listening to it, made his head spin and his heart race, filling him with an unsettling sense of dread as if his heart might explode at any moment. Letting out a deep sigh, Alone forcibly steadied his trembling heart and voiced the constraints he had in mind. 1. State your constraint. The use of magic requires the absolute execution of Babylonian hand signs. What do you wish to gain from this? Power that can slightly twist the laws of the world. Granted. Privacy settings. And one more. State your constraint. The use of magic requires the limited execution of the great Babylonian incantations. What do you wish to gain from this? The same as before. Following Alone's words, the voice fell silent for a moment. The slow-moving foot of a golem lifted into the air and then returned to the ground. Alone wondered if he had made a mistake. I accept. As if dispelling his concerns, the majestic voice from the heaven spoke words of affirmation. To you, who remember the hand signs and mysteries of a forgotten great god, I offer my gratitude for inheriting the will. The voice conveyed this message to Alone. Alone's expression turned puzzled at this. Although his face remained expressionless outwardly, Alone's eyes were full of questions. Inheriting the will? What does that mean? Naturally, Alone had no clue about any of that. The reason he chose the Babylonian hand signs and incantations as his constraints was simple. In the game, these 2 choices provided the highest possible magic attack power in return. Moreover, he had chosen these constraints so often that he had naturally memorized the Babylonian hand signs and incantations. Of course, he wasn't a genius, so he hadn't memorized all the signs and incantations he'd seen in the game, but he didn't feel burdened by it. Alone knew where the Babylonian hand signs and incantations were written. Therefore, while the voice from the heavens puzzled Alone, it was only for a moment. I will always be watching. You, who inherit the will. As Alone realized that the black and white world was gradually returning to its original state, he recognized that reality had resumed. He raised his hand to test the constraints while observing the golems charging at him from a distance. At the same time, mana began to flow from Alone's body, coursing through his heart and gathering at his raised fingertips. Privacy settings. The mana gathered at his fingertips was faint. Even though he was drawing on all the mana his body possessed, the orb of lightning, which should have been shining brightly according to the description in the book, only emitted a dim glow, like the last light of a dying old man. However, Alone felt neither disappointment nor surprise. He was acutely aware that this was the limitation of Alone, the 3rd son of the Palacio family. Nonetheless. Refraction. The moment he uttered those words, matching his recitation. Rebound. The small orb distorted into chaotic lines. Blue light. With a crackling sound, it began to emit a blue light. the small orb transformed into hundreds, thousands of lines, creating a non-linear light source that sparked and crackled. A light source that emitted a blue glow so cold it almost hurt to look at. Simultaneously, Alone formed a hand sign. His thumb covered his middle finger. It was a stance resembling the gesture used to flick one's forehead. However, Alone flipped his hand around, forming a posture reminiscent of the Buddha's Dharma wheel gesture. With that, he looked at the golem that had already reached him and declared the final incantation. Linear diffraction. When the blue light momentarily banished the darkness. Snap! He snapped his fingers, and a flash of light was released. Whoosh! There was no sound. All that could be heard was the faint whooshing noise following the flash, and what could be seen were the golems frozen as if time had stopped after the dazzling light illuminated the ravine. And then... crack, crackle! The dozens of golems collapsed without any resistance, crumbling into piles of stones. Evan, who had been rushing to fend off the golems attacking Alone, stood there with his mouth agape, stunned. What in the world? Privacy settings. He muttered, disbelief clear in his voice. After dealing with the golems. Were you hiding your power all this time? Evan, who had returned to the area where the carriage was and was preparing for camp, couldn't suppress his curiosity any longer and asked. No, not at all. Then, was that really second-rank magic? Yes. Evan wore a look of disbelief at Alone's response. I see. However, having realized that no matter how much he asked, he wouldn't get more answers from Alone, Evan sighed and nodded, signaling he understood. He then continued his preparations for the camp. Watching Evan, Alone kept his outward expression neutral, though he felt somewhat wronged. After all, Alone himself had no idea why the magic he had just performed turned out the way it did. I knew that using constraints would make me stronger to some extent, but... The combat in Psychedelia, the game Alone had played, was turn-based, not real-time. In the game, the hand signs and incantations were used to enhance magic damage by consuming turns. Depending on the magic being used, the appropriate hand signs would strengthen the spell itself. By selecting the correct incantations from hundreds of options within a limited time, the attributes of the spell could be enhanced. Privacy settings. For example, in the magic he used this time, known as Chain Lightning in Psychedelia, he used for specific incantations. Refraction, Rebound, Blue Light, and Linear Diffraction. By using these for incantations and hand signs, he enhanced the spell Chain Lightning. Additionally, he placed a constraint on himself to always use hand signs and incantations when casting magic, thus further strengthening the spell. In other words, Alone had expected the magic to be more than twice as powerful as usual. But it wasn't supposed to be this strong. In Psychedelia, using a hand sign or incantation consumed one turn each. So, the spell Alone had used this time would have been prepared over the course of 5 turns in game terms. Even considering that, is it really enough to overkill the golems? As Alone pondered this, he shrugged his shoulders. In truth, regardless of the specifics, the outcome had gone well according to his plans, and having the magic be more powerful than expected was a good thing. In fact, beyond simply being pleased, Alone's mind was now filled with curiosity. I wish I could experiment a bit if I could. The hand signs and incantations Alone used this time were ones commonly employed in Psychedelia when raising the protagonist as a glass cannon mage, intended for easily handling large-scale enemy encounters with powerful lightning magic. This meant that Alone had at least 10 more incantations and hand signs still intact in his memory that he hadn't used today. Moreover, the reason Alone's curiosity was particularly piqued was due to the noticeable changes in the magic each time he uttered an incantation. In the game, the incantations merely increased damage by 10% whenever the correct type of incantation was chosen, but here, it's different. Perhaps an ordinary magician wouldn't have noticed. But Alone, who had personally performed the magic and possessed a unique talent for mana control, had observed the magic's attributes changing each time an incantation was added. It wasn't just the power increasing, the very nature of the mana itself altered with each incantation. Therefore, I should conduct some experiments once my mana recovers. Alone closed his eyes inside the carriage, feeling good, even if his expression remained neutral. And at that moment, a girl appeared at the place where Alone had used magic, where only the piles of stones remained that could no longer become golems. A girl with eyes gleaming in a deep green. Privacy settings. No, the one who might have been called Rhine of Greed in the future silently passed by the stone heaps that had once been golems and looked at the door Alone had entered earlier. The door was cracked and worn, but the carvings on its frame emphasized that it was man-made, not a natural formation. However, Ryan knew that the carvings on this door's frame weren't meaningless. Born with a great mission and the innate ability to access the ancient library at any time, she could understand what was inscribed on the frame. From the Forgotten Age of Foreign Gods, the script of the Alanef Empire. Recognizing this, Ryan read the words carved into the frame. From Paleon, to the friend left alone. Ha! Ryan involuntarily let out a hollow laugh as she read the inscription. She knew that there was only one person who used the name Paleon in ancient texts. The Great Paleon. The one who had repelled the invasions of the Black Ones multiple times during the Age of Foreign Gods, and who had defeated the Alakolaka, a being that could make subjects offer their hearts just by looking at it. The noble, revered, great, and glorious emperor. Knowing that Paleon, as written in ancient language, referred to this one person, she couldn't help but chuckle. Simultaneously, it was made by a fellow named Paleon. Ryan recalled Alone's voice. As she gazed at the outer frame of the wall with a blank, somewhat melancholic expression, the image of the great moon silently watching over the frame surfaced in her mind, and a hypothesis began to cloud her thoughts. Negation and affirmation clashed in her mind, and the scales tipped towards denial. However, what next came to mind was the magic Alone had demonstrated after emerging from the labyrinth. His magic hadn't seemed particularly exceptional. But the incantations he muttered were different. The incantations the great moon whispered were things that didn't even exist in the ancient library. Recalling this, the scales that had been tipping now came to rest evenly balanced. Even though I knew that anyone the red moon would follow must be no ordinary person. Her thoughts finally reached the identity of the one leading the blue moon, and the scale within her mind finally tipped to the truth. Privacy settings. That the great moon, Paleon's close friend, was someone worthy of both respect and reverence. Realizing this, she felt a chill run down her spine as she looked toward where Alone was. As the distinct light of respect began to shine in her eyes, which had until now moved only by the command of the red moon. You've returned. Ryan turned her gaze slightly at the sense of an approaching presence, and there stood Deus, who had appeared without notice, nodding his head as his eyes gleamed. Yes. Did you gather any information? Ryan recalled how, a week ago, Deus had stopped monitoring Alone and instead followed the black-clad figure as it retreated, and asked him. He shook his head. No. I wasn't able to get any information. Why not? Deus began to explain what had happened when he chased after the black-clad figure, responding to Ryan's questioning tone. And then? Are you saying that the black-clad figure died while you were pursuing them? Yes. In empty air, their neck twisted around twice, and they died instantly. I didn't sense anything at all. Ryan fell silent for a moment at Deus's words. I think we should report this. I agree. After muttering these words, they exchanged a few more lines before disappearing from the spot. Finally, the only thing that remained there was the lonely moonlight. 2 months had passed since Alone obtained the constraint from the Whispering Labyrinth. Currently, Alsha was experiencing a period of great turmoil. There were 3 reasons for this. The first was the sudden death of Kig, the second son of the Duke's family, and Phelan, the second daughter. The second reason was that Duke Alsha, who had been suffering from illness and was predicted to have little time left, had finally passed away. The third reason was that Tamalian, the eldest son of the Duke's family, was found dead a day after the Duke's death, alongside his elder sister, Maliang. And they had both stabbed each other to death. Due to this chain of events, all the children who could inherit the Duke's title vanished overnight. As a result, Roria became the sole heir to the Duke's family. Privacy settings. Just like Count Palacio had done not long ago. Roria, who never thought she would ever sit in the Duke's study, now found herself quietly swallowing a breath there in just 2 short months. Rumors about Roria had already begun to spread within the Duke's family. However, amusingly, despite the quiet circulation of these rumors, she hadn't suffered any harm. She had a clear alibi. When the second son and daughter died, she had just returned from a ball. And the eldest son and daughter had killed each other. Moreover, she hadn't had any recent meetings with them, and most importantly, the reason she could avoid all suspicion was that during her absence at the ball, her organization had been completely destroyed. That's right. By the time she returned from the ball, she had lost all her power due to her damned family. Because of this, Roria was not being questioned in any of the procedural investigations, even though rumors were quietly spreading. The work had been executed so cleanly and perfectly. Good things will happen. Roria recalled those words once again. Those words, uttered so nonchalantly, had led to events that were anything but indifferent. She was already certain that everything that had happened was due to him. If anyone claimed these events were mere coincidences, they'd have to be considered lacking in intelligence due to how contrived everything seemed. What does he want? Roria recalled her conversation with Alone. Although he had outwardly rejected her request, he had handled everything more decisively than anyone else could have, and even a month after all the heirs of the Duke's family were dead, he had made no contact. Not even after she had absorbed her decapitated organizations with minimal losses. Pure goodwill? Roria smiled at the fleeting thought. It was absurd, even for her, to entertain such nonsense. After much contemplation, Roria reached one conclusion. Alone had some sort of plan. Of course, Roria didn't know what that plan was. But she had a vague understanding of one thing. Privacy settings. That plan requires the Alsha dukedom. Someone capable of killing the members of the Duke's family without leaving a trace, and so naturally wanted something he didn't have. Roria believed that what he wanted was most likely the renown of the Alsha dukedom. And what he could do with that renown. Roria closed her mouth tightly. It was only then that she realized just how absurd a pact she had made with the devil. Realizing this, Roria let out a hollow laugh but clenched her fist tightly. She knew that once a pact was made, there was no turning back. She understood too well what would happen if she broke the pact, having witnessed the fate of her four predecessors. Therefore, she didn't even consider betrayal. Instead, she decided to focus on the task at hand. I should at least send a thank you. For the first time, a smile appeared on her usually expressionless face, a smile even she was unaware of. A week later, a bottle of wine and a card arrived at the Count's study for Alone. The wine was from Cernans, an imperial territory, produced only 3 bottles a year, and each bottle was worth thousands of gold. Along with it came a card inscribed with words of respect. Alone, looking at the card that came with it, wore a puzzled expression. And 2 months after that. So, you're saying Roria, the third of the Alsha family, has become the Duke of Alsha? Yes. Alsha Roria? That's correct. Is there a problem, young master? Alone began to realize that something was amiss. It had been for months since hearing the news that Roria had become the Duke of Alsha. Now, only 5 years remained until the original story was set to begin. The world, once blanketed in white by winter, was gradually transitioning into spring, a season that brought with it a lethargic drowsiness to all living things. Young master, no, perhaps I should call you Count now. I haven't had the succession ceremony yet. Although Alone hadn't formally held the succession ceremony, he had begun to use the title of Count Palacio for himself, rather than the heir to the Count's family. Even so, you're effectively the Count now, aren't you? It's quite emotional to see you become the Count. Is that so? Alone gave a faint smile, a bitter one at that. It's something I never planned for, actually. Alone's original intention was not to become a count but to live a leisurely life as a noble, with the title serving only as a means to an end. However, due to the unexpected assassination of Leo, who was supposed to be the count, Alone found himself in this position. My goals have changed, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. For Alone, spending his time in Rodmill dabbling in magic research and baking bread wasn't a bad life. Still, being a count came with its own perks. The title of count allowed him to enjoy the peaceful noble life he originally envisioned in a more detailed and luxurious manner. Of course, with the increase in the quality of life came added responsibilities, but having dealt with minor tasks as the heir of the Count's family over the past 6 months, Alone found his work-life balance to be quite satisfactory. Privacy settings. I never thought being part of a rogue noble family would be so helpful. Typically, nobles are busy due to the territories they manage, but politics play a much larger role in their hectic lives. However, in the case of Count Palacio, since the family had not involved itself in politics, they could lead a leisurely life unless something urgent arose. Furthermore, while the assassins who dealt with Avalon had indeed taken care of them cleanly, they left behind all the money they had accumulated. This meant that unless he indulged in excessive luxury, the wealth they had amassed would be enough to last for 5 years. By the way, have you found any new information? If you're referring to information about the assassins who killed Leo. When Alone nodded, Evan shook his head. It seems even the Information Guild is taking this matter seriously, as they're conducting a meticulous investigation, but nothing has been uncovered yet. I see. At Evan's words, Alone clicked his tongue in slight irritation. He wasn't investigating the assassins to exact revenge on Leo's murderers. The reason he continued the investigation was that the past he knew was gradually diverging from what he remembered. The butterfly effect. I suppose I should call it that. I had anticipated some changes. Alone had already expected that the past would change due to the actions he had taken. After all, he had intervened here and there to prevent the occurrence of troublesome events in the future, as well as to secure the 5 sins. Even a small flap of a butterfly's wings can create a storm, and the things he did were on a scale far greater than the flap of a small butterfly's wings. They were enough to create a hurricane. It's only natural that the past would change, though there are some changes I don't fully understand. Aside from the fact that he officially became a count, Alone recently recalled one significant change in the future. Roria, who had become the Duke of Alsha 6 months ago, was originally supposed to be dead. Yet she not only survived but also became the Duke of Alsha, and her influence in the underworld was growing rapidly. Alone wondered which of his interventions had caused this change in the future, where she was supposed to die but instead lived and rose to power. After pondering for a moment, he shrugged, realizing it was pointless to think about it any further. Instead, he shifted his focus back to the assassins who had killed Leo. That's enough. Stop the investigation. Is that really okay? There's still some curiosity that hasn't been satisfied, but if the Information Guild can't uncover anything, then there's no point in continuing. There was another reason why Alone decided to stop the investigation he'd been pursuing for nearly a year. In this world, some knowledge is better left unknown. Besides, things seem rather ominous. The Information Guild in this world holds at least a little information on everything, largely because its owner and guildmaster is the leader of the Knights End Darkness. As far as Alone knew, only a few organizations could escape the Information Guild's network. Knowing this, Alone realized that there was nothing to gain from uncovering their identities. After all, the more you dig, the more assassins would come to silence you. Privacy settings. In the end, Alone decided to abandon his search for information. His goal was to prepare for any unforeseen circumstances, but he realized there was no need to bring more danger upon himself by acquiring knowledge that would only increase the threat to his life. Besides, if Leo was attacked by a group that the Information Guild couldn't even identify, then they wouldn't likely target me. Secret organizations usually don't make a move unless their identity is exposed or someone directly interferes with their activities. They were excessively obsessed with maintaining secrecy. Understood. Evan nodded, turning to leave the office. However, as if suddenly remembering something, he returned and handed Alone a letter. It was a letter from Yusha. I brought it with me to give you a report as well. Nodding briefly, Alone unfolded the letter and began to read. The letter contained updates on the orphanage daily life. Recently, whenever he read Yusha's letters, Alone felt a warm sensation in his heart without even realizing it. It was no wonder, as Yusha's letters, which arrived monthly, were filled with the mundane details of life at the orphanage, alongside the activities of the 5 sins. These letters had a way of warming his heart. Lately, Deus has been performing puppet shows frequently, and Sealrang is engrossed in games with friends. Additionally, there were stories about Rhine quietly reading books and making things, while Layden had taken a liking to landscaping. These tales naturally brought a fatherly smile to his face. Of course, he hadn't personally raised the 5 sins, nor had he ever met them face to face, but after nearly 5 years of supporting them and watching them grow, he couldn't help but feel this way. I think it's about time to send them out into the world. Alone was considering the idea of releasing the 5 sins from the orphanage. Evan. Yes, Count. How old is Yusha? No, how old are the 5 sins now? Let's see. Yusha should be 19 by now. And the others? The ones you personally brought in should be around that age as well. Rhine is 17, and Layden is probably 20 now. But why are you asking about their ages all of a sudden? I'm thinking it's time to send them out. Those kids? Well, I suppose it does seem a bit late for them to still be at the orphanage. Unlike the modern world, in this world, 16 was considered the age at which one became an adult and began participating in society. Understanding Alone's reasoning, Evan nodded in agreement. But didn't you gather them for a reason? Well, I did, but that doesn't mean I plan to keep them forever. Privacy settings. The reason Alone had gathered the 5 sins was to prevent them from awakening as the 5 sins who would destroy many kingdoms in the future. In other words, once they were sufficiently cared for, there was no longer a reason to keep them confined to the orphanage. Besides, if I place them in the right positions, each of them should be able to secure a place for themselves. Alone recalled the talents that each of the 5 sins possessed. He remembered the typical boss battle narration that exaggerated the strength of bosses in games. Yusha excels in faith, Deus in swordsmanship, Rein in research. While the exact extent of their talents wasn't clearly defined, Alone was confident they would manage well on their own. As he began to write letters to them, he decided to include a small gift for each as they were about to venture out into the world. Since I was planning to give them these gifts eventually, I might as well do it now. After spending considerable time writing letters to the 5, Alone sealed them and handed them to Evan, who then left to deliver the letters. Watching Evan's departing figure, Alone smiled quietly, thinking, if things go well, maybe I'll reap some benefits too. A few weeks later, in the basement of the orphanage in the eastern region, the 5 who had each received a letter from Alone gathered to read them. The first to speak after reading his letter was Deus. The Great Moon commands me to head to the Caliburn, the land of nights. To the colony in the desert. I hate the desert. I'm to go to the labyrinth city of Lartania. I'm assigned to the pleasure city, Raxas. As they read their letters, each of them mumbled to themselves, Sealrang, Rhine, and Laden among them. And then? The Holy Kingdom of Rosario. Muttering as she read her letter, Yusha caught Deus's attention, who spoke with a somewhat puzzled expression. What could be the purpose behind sending us to these places? Didn't it say in your letter, Deus? Well, the letter did say to become a knight in Caliburn, but I'm not sure why I should become a knight. Deus muttered, still confused by the innocent comment from Sealrang. I've told you before, Deus. We don't need to understand, we just need to follow. At Yusha's words, Deus nodded. And besides, we'll understand the reason once we get there. The letters clearly state what we need to do first, right? As Yusha spoke, they all looked at their letters again. Indeed, the letters not only instructed them on what professions to pursue but also mentioned that they would continue to receive support, along with the location of a gift from the Great Moon. Privacy settings. So, with Yusha's final words. Just remember, everyone, don't ever mention the Blue Moon anywhere unless he speaks of it first. The 5 sins, who were destined to become the 5 sins, now members of the Blue Moon, departed to follow Alone's instructions. 3 months later. Count, did you know? Deus has been knighted in Caliburn. Really? Alone, who was researching the ancient language of Babylonia, first heard the news about Deus from Evan. And another 3 months later. Count. What is it? Deus has established a knight order. A knight order? Yes. Hasn't it only been 2 months since he was knighted? And isn't creating a knight order something only an expert or above can do? That's right. He's brimming with talent. I think so too. The fact that word of his deeds has spread so quickly suggests that things are quite lively in Caliburn. There's even talk that he might become the 5th Master Knight within 10 years. Listening to Evan's words, Alone nodded in admiration. And then, 6 months later. Count. What? Deus has become one of the 5 Master Knights in Caliburn. Already? Yes. Alone was left in a daze by Evan's words. This all happened within just 1 year of the 5 sins leaving the orphanage. A year is indeed a long time. It was enough time for Alone to officially undergo the succession ceremony and become the Count of Palacio, and it also allowed him to steadily become accustomed to the duties that a count must manage. However, 1 year is by no means enough time for an ordinary person with no prior knowledge of swordsmanship to become a Master Knight. Evan. Yes? Master Knight, that means Swordmaster, right? Yes, that's correct. Swordmaster. To Alone, who had read countless fantasy novels, the title seemed rather unimpressive. However, unlike other mass-produced fantasy settings where simply wielding an aura blade was enough to be considered a swordmaster, Alone knew that the swordmasters of this world operated on a completely different scale. Information about the swordmasters of Psychedelia flashed through Alone's mind. In this world, a swordmaster wasn't just someone who could wield an aura blade. A swordmaster was a being who, beyond that, could unlock a unique ability called a derivative and could leap over castle walls with a single bound. In other words, a swordmaster in this world was more accurately described as a superhuman rather than just a swordsman who wielded an aura-clad blade. So, are you telling me that Deus has become one of those swordmasters? Privacy settings. Well, technically, he's just on the verge of becoming one. While it's true that he's been recognized as a Master Knight, according to information from the guild, he hasn't yet created a derivative. Then he's not really a Master Knight, is he? That might be due to the Northern Barbarians. Ah. At Evan's words, Alone immediately understood why Deus was recognized as a Master Knight. War. Yes. Caliburn had been waging war against the Northern Barbarians for over 10 years, and last year, they had lost one of their 5 Master Knights in the Northern conflict. Remembering this, Alone nodded. They're trying to quell anxiety while also proclaiming that they're still strong. There are probably a few other reasons as well, but that seems to be the main one. So, Deus isn't quite at the level of a Master Knight yet. No, it's just that he hasn't unlocked his derivative yet. But according to the Information Guild, he's already considered to be at the level of a Master Knight. They say that even Fiola, the 4th sword and a Master Knight herself, was defeated by Deus in a duel. Hearing Evan's words, Alone let out a small laugh and muttered to himself. How old is the youngest Master Knight? As far as I know, the youngest was 32 years old. Reinhard, the 1st sword of Caliburn, held the record. Or at least, he used to. Was he the youngest? Yes. Isn't he quite famous? Alone nodded at Evan's words. While he wasn't particularly interested in fame, he knew that Reinhard was an extraordinarily powerful individual. He remembered how Reinhard always appeared during the 3rd main episode of the game to temporarily assist the protagonist as an ally. Didn't he start wielding a sword at the age of 5 with incredible talent? Recalling the typical narration that would accompany Reinhard's entrance as a companion, Alone let out a laugh. It had taken Reinhard over 20 years to reach the level of a Master Knight, despite his unbelievable talent and strength. Becoming a Master Knight in just 1 year, does that even make sense? It's absolutely unbelievable. Even those with talent take 5 years just to awaken mana, 10 years to envelop their swords in it, and decades to create a derivative. Yet Deus cleared the first 2 stages in just 1 year. As Evan spoke, clicking his tongue with a hint of envy, Alone found himself unconsciously rubbing his chin. I knew he had talent, but I never imagined it would be to this extent. Well, it's a good thing. Privacy settings. From Alone's perspective, Deus's success wasn't something to mourn but to celebrate. The more successful Deus became, the more opportunities Alone would have to benefit from it in the future. Opportunities. I should be able to seize them, right? Alone glanced at the letters sitting on a desk in the corner of his office. The letters were from Yusha, who was in the Holy Kingdom of Rosario. Or maybe I won't. The reason Alone had such a conflicted expression was that over the past year, he had only received letters from Yusha. It seemed that the 5 of them were still communicating with each other. Well, I guess it can't be helped since I've never met them in person. But still, I prepared personal gifts for each of them, so not getting even a word of thanks feels a bit too much, doesn't it? Though Alone's expression remained neutral, there was a hint of frustration as he shook his head slightly. In truth, considering his original goal, Alone should have been grateful that the 5 sins hadn't destroyed any kingdoms. And so, with a slightly bitter expression, Alone thought to himself. As long as they're living well, that's enough for me. In the central district of Caliburn's capital, Curdam, there is a grand mansion located in the southern area, where only the highest-ranking nobles of the country reside. It was here that Deus Macallion, the leader of the famous Knight Order of Eclipse and the youngest person in the country to be granted the title of Master Knight, lived. Phew. In a stately office that wasn't quite to his taste but one he used nonetheless, Deus let out a quiet sigh, gazing leisurely out the window toward the mansion's garden. Brother! He spotted a young girl with the same deep purple eyes as him, waving at him with a bright smile from the garden. Seeing her, Deus couldn't help but smile back. The girl waved for a while before resuming her walk around the garden, and as Deus watched her, he found himself reminiscing about the past year, about the moment he had met the family he thought was dead and received the gift from the Great Moon. A year ago, Deus Macallion had already joined the Blue Moon and was operating under its guidance. However, unlike Yusha, he wasn't blindly devoted to the Great Moon. Although he was aware that the Great Moon had saved his life, that alone wasn't enough to make him pledge his loyalty. Thus, the reason Deus Macallion was affiliated with the Great Moon back then was twofold: first, to receive training from Yusha, and second, because the Great Moon had promised him the chance for revenge against the Black Sheep. After all, since losing his family, whom he valued as much as his own life, Deus had been consumed by anger and festering hatred, unable to sleep at night. Therefore, when he first received his mission, Deus wasn't particularly pleased with it. While he understood that his previous tasks under the Blue Moon were meant to deal with dark entities, this new mission seemed entirely out of the blue. Privacy settings. But when he arrived in Caliburn and reached the small inn in the southern region, where the letter from the Great Moon mentioned a gift, Deus couldn't believe his eyes. His sister, who should have been killed by the Black Sheep, was there, alive and well, working at the inn. Whom? Deus cleared his throat awkwardly, even though no one else was around. Thinking back, he still felt embarrassed about how, upon seeing his sister at the inn, he had immediately embraced her and burst into tears. After that emotional reunion, Deus learned about everything that had happened to his sister, Silly. She recounted how she had been dragged into a dark place by the Black Sheep, waiting for her turn to be killed when a bright light suddenly pulled her back outside. She had nearly been sold to a slaver but was saved by a man named Evan. Then, Count Palacio had provided her with precious medicine and continued to support and protect her until Deus arrived. After hearing all of this, Deus couldn't help but wonder how the Great Moon had known all of these things. He had never mentioned his family to anyone in the Blue Moon, nor did Yusha know anything about what had happened to him, except that he had been attacked by the Black Sheep. But before long, Deus stopped pondering this mystery. Instead, he recalled Yusha's words, the words she would often say to him. He knows everything. Soon you'll understand why I follow him. At first, he had dismissed those words, but now they were starting to make sense. Remembering them, Deus offered his gratitude to the Great Moon. For someone like him, who had been consumed by vengeance, the survival of his sister, and the fact that his own name had been secretly protecting her, was the greatest gift and an incomparable blessing. No matter what happens, Deus vowed to repay this kindness. Following the Great Moon's orders, he became a knight in Caliburn. Ironically, becoming a knight was easy for him. Aside from his existing abilities, Deus discovered that he had a surprising and exceptional talent for the sword. He knows everything. It was then that Deus realized that Yusha's words weren't just blind fanaticism but the truth. And by the time he became a knight, Deus understood why the Great Moon had sent him here to become a knight. My mission is to create a royal guard. Whether it was because of the battles with the barbarians or not, Caliburn allowed anyone who gained the king's recognition to form a knight order. Moreover, if someone became a master knight, they were permitted to exceed the usual limit on the number of members in their knight order. But this knight order wouldn't be made up of street thugs. Instead, it would be composed of talented swordsmen who had come to Caliburn to become knights. Commander, it's time. All right. Privacy settings. Deus stood up, acknowledging the knight who had spoken to him with eyes full of respect. He headed toward the training grounds. The knights, dressed in the black iron armor that symbolized eclipse, were preparing to depart on an expedition to fight the barbarians. Standing on the inspection platform, Deus looked over the assembled knights. He knew that not all of them would return with smiles on their faces. However, for Deus, this wasn't a significant issue. The Knight Order, the royal guard that would serve the Great Moon, needed to be stronger, far stronger than they were now. Deus knew all too well that the Great Moon didn't desire a Knight Order that would fall to mere northern barbarians. And so, unlike other knight commanders who would encourage and inspire their troops, Deus drew his sword and quietly uttered the motto of Eclipse. Prove yourself under the moon. With those words, he embarked on the expedition to fight the barbarians, aiming to create the greatest knight order worthy of serving the Great Moon.